They told him to observe and report. Nothing more. His orders were explicit. Stay hidden, stay silent, stay alive. But when 14 enemy soldiers stormed the ridge that morning, something inside him refused to obey. What followed wasn't courage in the usual sense. It was something stranger, a quiet accountant's logic applied to impossible violence, and it would rewrite how armies thought about survival itself. Sicily, July 1943. The air tastes like dust and diesel. The Allied invasion has begun, but the island isn't falling quickly. German and Italian forces hold the interior like a clenched fist. Every ridge, every stone farmhouse becomes a fortress. The heat is suffocating. Men move slowly under full gear, scanning tree lines, waiting for the crack of a rifle that could come from anywhere. This is not the war of grand maneuvers. This is arithmetic, small units probing, ambushes, casualties that don't make headlines but drain divisions all the same. The commanders need information more than they need heroics. Where are the enemy concentrations? Which roads are mined? Which villages still have snipers? So they send out observers. 2-man teams, sometimes alone, equipped with binoculars, a radio, a rifle. Their mission is patience. Climb high, stay low, watch, report coordinates. Let the artillery do the rest. It's a role for men who can sit still. Men who understand that survival often means doing nothing at all. Sergeant Audie Murphy draws this assignment on a morning that starts like any other. He's been in combat for weeks now. Sicilian sun has darkened his face, but he still looks young. Barely 22. Slight build, 5'5" in boots, the kind of soldier you might overlook in a lineup. But his superiors have noticed something. He doesn't panic, he doesn't waste ammunition, and he has a strange, almost unnerving focus when things go wrong. He climbs a ridge overlooking a valley crossroads. The position is good, clear sight lines, rock cover. He settles in with his rifle and his radio. His job is to watch the road below and call in any movement. That's it. He repeats the instruction to himself like a mantra. Observe, report. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. The morning passes in silence. Heat shimmers off the valley floor. Insects hum. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbles like distant thunder. Murphy scans the terrain with methodical precision. He's good at this. Patience comes naturally to him. He grew up hunting in Texas, long hours waiting for deer. The same discipline applies here. Stillness is survival. Then, around midday, movement. Not on the road, on the ridge itself, behind him. He hears boots scuffing stone, voices speaking German. His pulse spikes, but his breathing stays even. He counts the voices. More than a dozen, maybe more. They haven't seen him yet. He's partially concealed by a rock outcrop, but if they sweep the ridge, they'll find him in minutes. Every instinct says run. Slip down the far side of the ridge and disappear into the scrub. He could probably make it. Probably, but his radio is heavy, and the enemy is close. If he moves now, they'll hear him. If he stays, they'll find him. The math is bad either way. And then he notices something else. The German patrol isn't just passing through. They're setting up. 2 men are unpacking a machine gun. Others are spreading out along the ridge. They're preparing an ambush for American forces moving up the valley. His forces, his friends. If he runs, he might survive. But the men below won't know what's waiting for them. If he radios now, the Germans will hear the transmission and kill him before he finishes. There's no good option. Only bad ones and worse ones. Murphy's mind works through the variables with the same cold clarity he used to calculate farm yields back home. He looks at the rocks, the angles, the distance, and he makes a choice that defies every order he's been given. Like and subscribe if you want more true wartime ingenuity. Audie Leon Murphy was born in 1925 in a sharecropper's shack near Kingston, Texas, the fifth of 12 children. His father drifted in and out of their lives. His mother died when Audie was 16. Poverty wasn't an abstract concept. It was hunger. It was watching siblings go without shoes. It was adult responsibility landing on a child's shoulders because there was no one else. He dropped out of school in 5th grade to pick cotton, 10 cents per 100 pounds. His hands bled. His back ached. But he was good at it, good at pushing through discomfort, good at turning off the part of his brain that complained. He learned to hunt to feed his brothers and sisters, borrowed rifles, scarce ammunition. Every shot had to count. So he taught himself to aim, to breathe, to wait for the exact right moment. He wasn't big, he wasn't loud, he didn't start fights or boast, but people who knew him noticed a kind of intensity. When he focused on something, everything else disappeared. A teacher once said he had the most serious eyes she'd ever seen on a boy, like he was already carrying weight no one else could see. When the war broke out, Murphy tried to enlist. The Marines rejected him. Too short. The paratroopers rejected him. Too light. The Army finally took him, reluctantly, and assigned him to infantry. Basic training instructors weren't impressed. He looked like a kid playing soldier. But on the rifle range, something changed. He posted scores that made sergeants double-check the targets. Marksmanship wasn't luck for him. It was geometry, breath control, trigger discipline, all the patience he'd learned waiting in Texas brush. He shipped to North Africa in early 1943, then Sicily, then Italy. He fought at Salerno, Anzio, southern France. With every engagement, the same pattern emerged. He stayed calm when others froze. He made decisions fast, but never reckless. And he had an unnerving ability to read terrain, to see, almost instinctively, where danger would come from. His platoon started calling him lucky, but it wasn't luck. It was preparation meeting circumstance. He studied the land like a hunter. He memorized German tactics. He knew the sound of different weapons by ear. Mauser versus Garand, MG-42 versus Browning. He could tell you the rate of fire, the range, the reload time. Not because he was a scholar, but because information was survival. And there was something else, a kind of moral simplicity. He didn't think about glory. He thought about the men next to him. If they died because he hesitated, that was unacceptable. If they died because he miscalculated, that was on him. So he didn't miscalculate. He worked the problem until there was a solution. And if the solution required him to take risks no one else would, so be it. That wasn't bravery. That was just math. By the time he reached that ridge in Sicily, he'd already earned a reputation. Officers trusted him. Enlisted men followed him. Not because he was loud or charismatic, but because he was competent. And in war, competence is the highest form of kindness. So when he saw the German machine gun team setting up, his mind didn't go to fear. It went to calculation. 14 men, maybe more, against one. Poor odds, but not impossible. And if he didn't act, the odds for the men in the valley would be worse. The problem wasn't theoretical. It was immediate. 14 German soldiers occupying high ground, a machine gun with overlapping fields of fire, American forces advancing below, unaware, no time to call for support, no room for error. Standard doctrine said, withdraw, evade, report when safe. But doctrine assumed you had a clean escape route. Murphy didn't. The Germans were spreading out along the ridge. If he moved, they'd see him. If he stayed hidden, they'd find him. And in the minutes it would take to crawl out of sight, the ambush below would begin. He considered his ammunition. Rifle, full magazine, 2 spares, 48 rounds total. enough to kill maybe 5 or 6 men if every shot landed perfectly. Not enough to take 14, not in a straight fight. So a straight fight was out. He looked at the terrain again. The Germans were focused downslope toward the valley. They expected threats from below, not behind. Murphy was positioned slightly above them, maybe 30 yards back. The rocks gave partial cover. Not much, but enough to break sight lines if he moved carefully. And there was the machine gun. If he could take out the crew first, the others would lose their heaviest weapon. Infantry without support are vulnerable, especially if they're surprised, especially if they don't know how many attackers they're facing. Murphy's breathing slowed. His heartbeat steadied. This wasn't courage in the cinematic sense. It was the same cold focus he used to hunt as a boy, the same logic. Identify the target, control your breath, squeeze, don't pull, and move before they know where the shot came from. He raised his rifle, sighted the machine gunner. The man was kneeling, adjusting the tripod. Unaware. Murphy exhaled halfway and held it. The rifle cracked. The gunner collapsed. The second crew member turned, confused, reaching for the gun. Murphy fired again. The man dropped. For a single frozen moment, the ridge went silent. The Germans didn't understand what had happened. The shots sounded close, but not from the valley. From behind. Impossible. Then someone shouted. Figures spun around. Rifles came up. Murphy was already moving. He slid left behind a boulder, worked the bolt, fired again. A German stumbled backward. The others scattered, diving for cover. But they didn't know where he was. They fired blindly, bullets sparking off rocks in the wrong direction. Murphy shifted right, found another angle, dropped another man. Panic is contagious. The Germans were trained, disciplined, but they were also human, and humans don't expect to be attacked from behind on ground they thought was secure. They shouted orders, contradicting each other. Some fired downslope, thinking the attack was coming from the valley. Others swung their rifles uphill, searching the rocks. Murphy kept moving. Short bursts of motion between shots. Fire, shift, fire, shift. He used the terrain like a chess player. Every rock was a piece, every angle a move. The Germans couldn't pin him down because he never stayed in one place long enough. But 14 men is still 14 men. And Murphy was running low on ammunition. He counted rounds in his head. 23 left, then 20. The Germans were starting to regroup. One NCO, braver or smarter than the rest, began organizing a flanking move. If they surrounded him, it was over. Murphy saw the maneuver forming, 3 men breaking left, using cover. He had seconds to disrupt it. He aimed for the NCO, fired, missed. The man dove. Murphy cursed under his breath, adjusted, fired again. This time the NCO went down. The flanking attempt stalled, but now he was exposed. 2 Germans saw the muzzle flash. They opened up with coordinated fire. Rounds chewed into the rock inches from Murphy's head. Stone fragments cut his face. He dropped flat, rolled, came up firing. 1 German fell. The other ducked. 12 rounds left. Maybe 8 enemy soldiers still combat effective. The math was getting tighter. In that moment, Murphy noticed something the Germans didn't. The machine gun was still there. Abandoned. Both crew members down. The weapon itself undamaged. Loaded belt. Ready to fire. It was 20 feet away. Open ground. If he ran for it, he'd be exposed for 3, maybe 4 seconds. Long enough to die. But if he reached it, the odds flipped. 14 against 1 becomes 1 with a machine gun against 13 with rifles. Murphy didn't hesitate. Hesitation is where men die. He sprinted, low and fast. Bullets snapped past him. One tugged his sleeve. Another kicked up dirt at his feet. He dove the last few feet, slid behind the gun, swung it around. The Germans saw him grab the weapon. A few started to rush him, trying to close the distance before he could get it operational. But Murphy had watched machine gun crews in training. He knew the mechanics: charging handle, safety, sight picture. His hands moved with practiced speed. The MG-42 opened up. 1,200 rounds per minute. The sound is unmistakable. A tearing rip, like canvas shredding. The rushing Germans went down in a hail of fire. The others threw themselves flat or scrambled for cover. But cover that protects against rifles doesn't always stop machine gun fire. Murphy swept the weapon left to right. Sustained bursts. Calculated. Controlled. 3 more Germans fell. The survivors broke. They ran. Stumbling down slope, back toward their own lines. Murphy let them go. He wasn't interested in slaughter. He was interested in math. The threat was neutralized. The ambush was over. He stayed behind the gun for another minute, breathing hard, scanning for movement. Nothing. The ridge was quiet except for the wind and the distant rumble of artillery. He counted the bodies. 11. 3 escaped, 14 men engaged, 11 casualties, 3 routed, 1 American defender. He checked himself for wounds, cuts from stone fragments, a bruise where he'd slammed into rock. Nothing serious. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline crash. He let them shake. There was no shame in it. The body does what it does. Then he remembered the radio. He crawled back to his original position, keyed the mic, and reported. Enemy patrol eliminated. Ridge secure. Friendlies could advance safely. The voice on the other end asked him to confirm. Repeat last. Murphy did. There was a long pause. Then, understood. Hold position. Support en route. When the American squad reached him 20 minutes later, they found him sitting on a rock, rifle across his lap, surrounded by German dead. The squad leader stared, asked what happened. Murphy shrugged, said they walked into his position. He didn't have a choice. The officer looked at the bodies, the machine gun, the spent brass glittering in the sun. He asked how many there were. Murphy said 14. The officer asked how many Americans were with him. Murphy said none, just him. No one spoke for a moment. Then the squad leader nodded slowly, told him good work. Murphy didn't reply. He was already thinking about the next ridge, the next mission, the next problem. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. 10 minutes that would become a case study. Because Murphy hadn't just survived, he'd demonstrated principles that contradicted accepted wisdom. Doctrine said, avoid engagement when outnumbered. Murphy engaged anyway. Doctrine said, hold position and call for support. Murphy attacked. Doctrine said, suppressive fire and withdraw. Murphy advanced, and he won. Within days, the after-action report reached higher command. Officers read it with skepticism. 14 enemy combatants engaged by a single soldier? 11 confirmed kills? It sounded like propaganda, or exaggeration, or both. So they sent investigators, interviewed Murphy, interviewed the squad that relieved him, examined the site. The evidence was undeniable. 14 sets of German equipment, 11 bodies, blood trails where the wounded were dragged away, ejected brass from Murphy's rifle scattered across multiple positions, and the machine gun, still warm, now captured American property. A colonel reviewing the report asked the question everyone was thinking, how? Murphy's answer was blunt. He used the terrain. He kept moving. He didn't give them time to organize, and he went for their heavy weapon. The colonel pressed. But what made you think you could win? Murphy looked at him without expression, said he didn't think about winning. He thought about what would happen if he didn't try. The men in the valley would have walked into that ambush. So trying was the only option. It wasn't bravado, it was something stranger, a fatalism that looked like courage. Murphy genuinely didn't seem to calculate his own survival into the equation. He calculated the objective, the mission, the outcome. His life was just another variable, important, but not more important than the problem itself. The report moved up the chain. Eventually it reached analysts tasked with understanding why some soldiers break and others don't, why some units collapse under fire and others hold. The question wasn't academic. Allied forces were preparing for the push into mainland Europe. Casualties were projected to be catastrophic. Anything that improved survival rates mattered. Murphy's engagement became a teaching example, not because it was typical, but because it illustrated principles that could be trained. Aggression disrupts enemy decision-making. Movement degrades enemy accuracy. Surprise multiplies effective firepower. These weren't new ideas, but Murphy had executed them perfectly under the worst possible conditions. Training programs began incorporating scenario-based drills, small unit ambushes, outnumbered engagements. The emphasis shifted from passive defense to aggressive counteraction. Some commanders resisted. Aggression gets people killed, they argued, but the data suggested otherwise. Passivity under fire often led to encirclement and annihilation. Controlled aggression, even when outnumbered, created opportunities. Murphy himself didn't care about doctrine. He kept fighting Italy, France, Germany. With each engagement, the same pattern: impossible odds, calculated risk, unlikely survival. By the time the war ended, he'd been wounded 3 times, earned every combat decoration the United States could award, including the Medal of Honor, became the most decorated American soldier of World War II. But the Medal of Honor wasn't for Sicily. That came later, January 1945, Holtzwihr, France. Another impossible situation. Murphy alone on a burning tank destroyer holding off an entire German company. 6 tanks, waves of infantry. For an hour, until reinforcements arrived, the same cold logic, the same refusal to calculate his own life into the equation. Historians would later call him a hero. Murphy rejected the word, said heroes were the men who didn't come home. He was just someone who happened to survive. But survival wasn't luck. It was discipline, training, and a mind that could turn fear into geometry. The Sicily engagement didn't change the course of the war. No single skirmish does. But its ripple effect was measurable. The tactical lessons spread through training manuals. Small unit leaders studied the case, emphasized movement and aggression in contact drills. Soldiers learned that being outnumbered wasn't an automatic death sentence, that terrain and initiative could offset numerical disadvantage. Survival rates in isolated engagements improved, not dramatically. War is still war, but marginally. A few more men made it home. A few more squads held their ground when doctrine said they should have been overrun. The change was incremental, but in aggregate, incremental changes saved divisions. Murphy's broader impact came later. After the war, he struggled. What civilians called peacetime, Murphy experienced as unmoored drifting. The focus that saved him in combat became a liability. He couldn't sleep. Loud noises triggered violent reactions. Crowds felt like ambushes. He self-medicated, drank, fought depression, but he also spoke openly about it. At a time when veterans were expected to quietly reintegrate, Murphy talked about nightmares, about survivors' guilt, about the men who didn't come home and why their absence haunted him. He became, unintentionally, one of the first prominent advocates for what would later be called PTSD. His autobiography, To Hell and Back, became a bestseller, not because it glorified war, but because it didn't. Murphy described fear, exhaustion, mistakes, the randomness of death. Readers responded because it felt true. Veterans saw their own experiences reflected. Families of the dead found a vocabulary for grief. Hollywood made a film of the book. Murphy played himself. Critics noted the strange dissonance of watching a real soldier reenact his own trauma. But Murphy insisted on accuracy, pushed back against scripts that made war look clean or heroic. The film became one of the highest-grossing of the 1950s, and it planted seeds. Decades later, filmmakers citing it as influence would create a new genre of war film, gritty, human, focused on the individual rather than the grand strategy. Murphy died in a plane crash in 1971. He was 45. By then, his decorations were legend. But the decorations weren't his legacy. His legacy was the example. That ordinary people, through discipline and clarity, can do extraordinary things. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear control the outcome. That survival often requires doing exactly what you're told not to do. The ridge in Sicily is unmarked. No monument, no plaque, just rock and scrub and wind. But the lesson lives in doctrine, in training, in the way soldiers are taught to think under fire, move, adapt, attack the problem, not the fear. Murphy didn't invent those principles, but he proved them in the most unforgiving laboratory imaginable. Years after the war, a journalist asked Murphy about Sicily, about the moment he decided to fight rather than hide. Murphy thought for a long time before answering, said he didn't remember deciding, just acting. The decision, if you could call it that, was made long before, in the Texas fields where he learned to shoot, in the poverty that taught him problems don't solve themselves, in the basic understanding that some things matter more than your own skin, the journalist pressed. But weren't you afraid? Murphy smiled, said, of course, fear is biology. You can't turn it off. But you can ignore it long enough to do what needs doing. And if you train hard enough, ignore becomes reflex. The body moves before the brain catches up. By the time you realize you're terrified, the problem's already solved. Or you're already dead. Either way, the fear didn't matter. That answer frustrated people. They wanted heroism to be grander, more intentional. But Murphy's version was more useful, because intention is fragile. Heroism built on intention collapses when intention falters. Heroism built on training, on reflex, on practiced discipline, that endures. That's what Murphy offered. Not inspiration, instruction. His grave is in Arlington National Cemetery, Section 46, a simple white headstone. Same as everyone else. No special treatment, he would have insisted. On Memorial Day, it's one of the most visited sites in the cemetery. Coins and flowers pile up. People leave notes. Many are from veterans, thanking him. Not for winning medals, but for speaking honestly, for showing that even the strongest break. That survival isn't weakness, that asking for help isn't failure. There's a persistent myth that warriors are born, that some men are simply wired for combat. Murphy's life suggests otherwise. He wasn't born fearless. He was born poor and hungry and responsible for people who depended on him. War didn't reveal some hidden nature. It demanded skills he'd already learned, patience, precision, the ability to act when action seemed impossible. Those skills came from necessity, from practice, from a refusal to accept that circumstances dictate outcomes. The ridge in Sicily wasn't the first time Murphy defied orders. It wasn't the last, but it was perhaps the clearest example of his philosophy. That rules exist to guide, not to govern. That doctrine is a starting point, not a ceiling. That the most important question isn't, what am I allowed to do, but what needs to be done? 14 men tried to kill him. 11 failed permanently. 3 fled. And a sharecropper's son from Texas, armed with a rifle and a borrowed machine gun, held a ridge that doctrine said couldn't be held. Not because he was superhuman, because he understood something most people don't, that the difference between impossible and unlikely is often just the willingness to try. He never called it courage, he called it arithmetic, the cold, unforgiving math of survival. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, he proved that sometimes the equation works, that one person in the right place with the right training and the wrong orders can change everything. The lesson isn't that we should all be Murphy. Most of us aren't. Most of us never face those choices. But the lesson is that ordinary people, when circumstances demand, are capable of extraordinary things. Not because they're special, because they're prepared, because they've practiced, because they've learned to turn fear into focus and focus into action. That ridge in Sicily is quiet now. The wind moves through the same rocks. The same sun beats down. And somewhere in the stone, if you know where to look, you can still find the scars. Bullet holes, chipped rock, the faint outline of a battle that lasted 10 minutes and echoed for 80 years. Murphy climbed that ridge to observe. He stayed to fight. And in doing so, he left behind something more valuable than victory. He left proof. That courage isn't magic, it's muscle. And like any muscle, it can be trained,